to our October Challenge Seminar. This is the United Nations Association for Greater Lincolnshire. We are putting together a series of recorded discussions and presentations around the theme of sustainable development. It is October 2021, and right on topic, we are discussing COP26, Conference of the Parties 26, which starts next week up in Glasgow. So welcome to those taking part and to those who are listening at a later stage. If you put up the PowerPoint, Bert, that'd be great. Thank you. UNA Greater Lincolnshire. The next slide, please. And so we have a COP26 on our agenda. The importance of COP26. Whilst we're doing a short introduction presentation, can you be thinking about what we would want from COP26 in terms of particularly the air agenda or clean air agenda and climate, land and water, and obviously in the light of that, human behaviours. And please bear in mind when we are discussing this, bring to the fore what you think are the barriers and opportunities that COP presents, both globally, but more importantly around Greater Lincolnshire, and how can Greater Lincolnshire then contribute to our desired outcomes. That's the kind of things we're looking for over the period of time of this conversation. Next slide then, Bert, thank you. We have these just phrased before, if not you, then who, and if not now, then when. And to that I've added, if not you who can, then who will make a difference? And of course, COP26 throws into a sharp relief what has happened in the last couple of generations. And to start this off, I'm going to go a bit of a reflection on perhaps my journey at my age. I think back and when I was born, rationing, post-war rationing was still in place. This will apply to other people watching this at a later stage. But when people think, well, what does rationing mean? It meant that there was limited availability of key things, in particular food. And so families were given ration books, which were enabled to them to purchase things on a proportionate amount at the local shops. So when I started in my life, the idea of conspicuous consumption and massive consumption, overconsumption, weren't really part of the agenda. My family that I was born into had a garden. We also had an allotment. We grew food. It's interesting how in COVID times, or in recent times of lockdowns, people have been turning back to that as being a way of moving things differently for themselves. But in the same way that there were a post-war generation that recycled things. I can't remember Mum really wanting to throw anything away that was of value again. Again, it's the reuse and repurpose, recycle agenda that was part of their life, certainly during the early war period and then the post-war period. And I always remember once we recently cleared my parents' house, and my father, who was in the construction industry, brought some wood home with massive nails in. And I remember at age 6 or 7, pulling nails out of this piece of wood and straightening them. Only very recently, in the last 2 months, I've cleared them out of his garage as we cleared his home. Recycling, repurposing was part of the lifestyle then. And of course, as I grew, it changed. Certainly when I went to school, I walked 5 miles and to and from school. And it's interesting when my daughter and others are talking about where they take their child to school, they're talking about school possibly 8 or 9 or 10 miles away. Emerging adulthood was one of the emerging nature of consumption and buying things and buying more things. And it was about how you had more things to own, or even as it went down the line, to throw away. I studied economics at university, and there's a whole agenda there in the late 60s, early 70s around markets and how markets worked. And for those economists amongst you, you'll realize that markets are good things and good servants, but can be poor masters. And of course, there was a concept around externalities at the time. We talked about outside of the marketplace, if you polluted something and no one had to pay for it, it didn't really matter. Only recently I saw a commentary about Coca-Cola deciding that if they moved from glass bottles to plastic bottles, the whole cost of recycling and removing all those things that was borne by Coca-Cola at the time was outsourced to the local rubbish collectors. So the plastic bottles became part of local ownership rather than private ownership of the company. I was brought up in the time when there was a coal strike, a 3-day week, when electricity was turned off at certain places for a period of time because there was shortage of energy. There aren't many coal mines left in Britain anymore. There was a change of outcome for the coal industry, and in some ways that's been a massive benefit for the climate agenda in this country. I got involved in education, and if you go to 1976, there was a great debate about education for what. It was referred to, I think it was the great debate it was talked about. And is it about individual progression, or is it about getting a job? I don't think that's ever changed. But of course, what has happened is that the focus on learning has become central to a youngster's experience. And the competition within education and the agenda for education, in my opinion, has moved towards a great idea about I have my rights to do this and I want to do that. And that was exhibited in certainly some of the work I did with others in post-16 work in the year 2000, when curriculum 2000 came in. And as a teacher then, I remember doing presentations on what were then called general studies. And we talked about climate change, and we talked about health, and we talked about the agendas that are now carried within the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. I remember doing a presentation with 16 to 17-year-olds on issues around air pollution in cities, and inviting them to decide whether they wanted a car or a bicycle to get around on. And majority at the time certainly said, we want a car. And then you throw in the question, well, suppose your children at the local primary school are affected by the pollution from the cars. Oh, well, that's not a problem. We'll just move them from that school, was the answer, which shocked me. Only in recent times have we seen children actually damaged by air pollution around schools in significant cities. The idea about the world is for me and mine and here and now, as opposed to we and ours and the world and the future. And it seems that in this title of COP26, we throw up two names in particular. One is David Attenborough, who has been a stimulus for great thinking and great debate around our natural world and all that entails. And another name is Greta Thunberg, who as a child has made the news headlines and has invoked all sorts of responses. But nevertheless, it has been a period of time when people have started to realize that externalities to the market, the pollution of land, of air, of water, are all our costs. And whatever comes next is something that has to be dealt with by this next generation as they move forward, supported by the current generation who can. And that's what today is about. So if we move to the next slide, Bert. COP26 is the United Nations Climate Change Conference. It's interesting that it's built on conferences in the past, and it's been bringing people together for summits, for the Conference of the Parties. It's a 26th annual summit, giving its name COP26. And most experts believe it has a unique urgency. And if you look at the local, the national, the international press around this, it certainly has brought about massive amounts of reporting and writing and film and media work. Next slide, please. COP26 builds on what happened really in 21, which took place in Paris. And that was I won't read the slide, but it's the momentous moment when every country agreed to work towards this below 2 degrees agenda around climate change. I remember my daughter, who was then working with a company, was invited to do the voiceover for a presentation around not just about bringing the climate warming down, but also about mitigation and adaptation. I think her Northern England accent was thankfully received by others, including President Obama, who was pleased to hear a, inverted commas, a proper English speaker. But 2015 was the starting point for what came forward, and they agreed every 5 years they'd come back with an updated plan. And COP26 is this particular moment in time. Next one, Bert. So what is it they're hoping to do? These are the goals of COP26. One is to secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. It's interesting when we hear the news even today about the state of play of particular nations and their possibilities of attaining that. So that certainly that's a challenging target by countries, even as we speak today. And it talked about the phasing out of coal to curtail deforestation, speed up the switch to electric vehicles and other heating sources, and encourage investment in renewables. That's the goals that are listed within that goal number 1. Next slide, please. Okay, and the next slide talks about adapting and adaptation to protect communities and natural habitats. It's not sufficient. And again, if we look at the goals of Sustainable Development 2030, it relates to a variety of things, not just climate. And of course, climate and adapting things to protect communities and natural habitats is very important. Working together to restore ecosystems. If you look at the work of David Attenborough and the teams that he works with, talk about how nature needs to be nurtured and supported, and we are part of nature, we are not separate from it. And it talks about the requirement in our new worlds to build defenses and warning systems and resilient infrastructure. It talks about agriculture as well, and to avoid loss of homes, livelihoods and lives, and the devastation that would happen if climate change is not addressed, that's left to our grandchildren's grandchildren, as we can forecast even now, is significant. Next slide, please. In terms of the finance side of things, we had a talk by John Firth of Acclimatise at the time last January, and he talked about how things are bought or sold can have a massive influence on climate and adaptation and mitigation. And of course, if it's about how you pay for things, it involves finance. And finance and investment is important, but it's also not just about how we buy and sell things in consumable goods or capital goods. It's also about how we mobilize finance to support others. And international finance must play their part. I need to work towards unleashing those private and public sector finance to secure global net zero. Next slide, please, Bert. Working together. It's interesting when people talk about working together because it has to be in the interest of those together. Nobody escapes climate change. Nobody escapes the impact of climate change. So finalizing the Paris rulebook, which the detailed rules apply, and accelerate action to tackle climate crisis through collaboration is so significant. And the purpose of our challenge seminars over the last year have been to say, what new thinking and new actions can we take locally, certainly in Greater Lincolnshire, and what can we invite others to engage with in Lincolnshire and beyond to make a difference. So it's about not just words, it's also about actions. And some of those things can be done by individuals. Much of it has to be done by individuals working together as business and communities. But importantly, it's also about education of those in business and communities and the younger and older generation. Next slide, please, Bert. What we see on the 2030 sustainable goals And if you think about the origin of these that flowed from the Millennium Goals at the turn of the century, which were renewed as we ran up to 2015, has left us with these 17 goals. And what you see within those 17 goals are interrelatedness of both actions and outcomes. So if it's about the way we make things in terms of consumption and production, that has an impact on climate. So it's about the interrelatedness of goals I'd like just raise and say, look, if by addressing the water agenda or the land agenda or the air agenda, by doing so, we impact on the climate and how well we live. So in terms of an introduction, I've hoped I have managed to raise some thoughts. I hope I've managed to broaden it out in terms of the climate change and sustainable goals, and give us an opportunity to share what we think are important issues. And perhaps as we go through our conversation, we can arrive at 3 significant things that if we were to write on behalf of UNA Greater Lincolnshire to all and sundry, what 3 things will we really want from COP26? I'll leave it there and I'll come back with a little more after our discussion. So if we can go back to our full screen, Bert, and I'll invite people to have a say. Who would like to pick up first?
Just Clive. Can I just ask a general question? Obviously, COP26 is very big and a big agenda, so it is difficult to go from that to individual small things. But one of the things that I'm worried about is the differences across the world and the concept of China with lots of coal in use, and perhaps other countries where they need to use certain fuels because it's the only way that they can live. It's true, that's a very big agenda, but does anyone have any thoughts about that? Will COP26 actually try to even out the inequalities?
Well, I can say on behalf of the African Union, that's a massive concern for them, because the Western nations have reduced usage of coal dramatically, but we're using more oil and gas. And the Africans are really concerned because a lot of their countries have significant coal reserves. They need energy for development. And a lot of their oil and gas is actually exported and taken out where they have it. It's actually been taken out by foreign companies. So they're a bit stuck between a rock and a hard place. They would like to convert to renewable energy, but their capacity to do that again is significantly restricted, and more than half the population of the whole continent have no electricity at all. So it will be very interesting to see whether there is a true international movement at COP26, or everybody drops back into their national positions. And a bit of a taster for it is the fact that the funds that were promised in Paris have not materialized. So the proof of the pudding so far is that the wealthier nations who've benefited from industrialization and fossil fuels are not prepared to share the wealth they've earned through that with countries that are not going to be allowed to.
Is there an agenda that's carried within the COP26 around support for developing nations? I've read that is the case. And is that something that we want to particular highlight, that if we are seeking to make a difference, then it needs to be bringing along those who can support others to support them as well?
Yeah, it's a good point you make. There were so many things. I'm only now getting the flavour of many of the events because I'm now presenting at 2 of them at COP26, Clive. And I'm sure that will be covered, as will agendas that disappointingly are going to be focused around those that are not attending, which we know who they are. All I can sort of say as far as I'm concerned, and positive activities, and that and the region, as far as I'm concerned, the agenda I really want to focus on is more about how the community needs to be involved in this entire process. It's so political at the moment that we're in danger perhaps of missing a great opportunity to really engage with local community activist groups that really can make a huge difference, as they're already proven to have innovative ideas. They're committed to their local environment. After all, that's where they live, play and work. So they've got a vested interest in supporting conservation and biodiversity. And they need to be educated that there are things that they can be actively involved in. Now, there are some UK signs that Power to Change, the Co-op, Power, Octopus, and all of these Midland Energy Hub, who I'm actually presenting for as well, they are getting their act together, amazingly, with hardly any funding from this government. So I am really, because I can't alter the wider global spectrum and say, Russia, get your bums there, and China, they know they should be there, but they're not. Therefore, I can't really influence them at that high diplomatic or political level. So I hope that that in my own small way, in our small way, that we can contribute to discuss how we need to involve active groups like ours, which does include our association in this discussion of what can we do locally, who can we work with, who's going to support us with funding, because when all said and done, I think the evidence is out there of how important volunteers are, how important our community is, how important our biodiversity, our woodlands, our insect life, our biodiversity are. And we also know that there's a huge amount of great community initiatives that genuinely are working and able to evidence that they're not just providing solutions around climate change through using renewable energy technologies, but they're also actively involved perhaps in communities, working on planting trees, creating new bee habitats, and all of those sort of things that are really going to affect us. So I'm hopeful that somewhere along the line, we generally can make that small difference. And I'm not really wanting to sort of punch above my weight. I do know, I think, how the community desperately wants to be involved, but I hear very few stories on the agendas that I've already looked at, whether it's reducing carbon emissions, or it's almost too technical in a way, and it should be brought down so the community is part of the co-design and the co-development of some of these initiatives. But they must, and I'll repeat this, they must be encouraged to find or be supported through monies, because otherwise that they will eventually give up.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Roger, you got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I wish I shared Mark's optimism for the future, because I do not. I mean, we've known about the mechanism of climate change since Svante Arrhenius wrote about it in 1896. So we've known for over 120 years about the mechanism of burning fossil fuels and other combustions, and how it would create global warming. We've known for, say, well over a century. We've known for rather less than that, but since the Rio summit about the need, that was when the International Panel on Climate Change was set up, and still things are getting worse and worse, and nobody's prepared to actually do anything. I mean, well, no, that's not true. Some people are, but most people are not. I mean, I've talked to maybe 100 people in the last few months about the need to write to our MPs and to demand that at COP26 some definitive and useful action is taken. Most people aren't even prepared to write to their MP. It takes about 5 or 20 minutes to send an email on your to your MP. I wonder whether any of the 7 people on this group tonight have actually done that.
Roger, I'm working with both of our local MPs, just for the record.
I'm glad to hear it.
And they are supportive.
I'm glad to hear it, but I mean, it's not good enough to be supportive. They've actually got to do something. I mean, if everybody in the greater Lincolnshire area went carbon neutral tonight, it would make no difference to the world at all. It requires international action, requires global action by international politicians. And I'm not really very convinced that anything is going to happen at COP26 at all. It'll be useful. I mean, 30 years we're talking about to 2050, is it? I mean, it's an awfully long time. We nearly fought 2 world wars in 30 years. Surely we could do something better than this in 30 years that's available to us.
Yes, I think you're right, Roger, that in terms of the agendas that are carried by politicians, shaped by those who influence them. So it's no surprise to me that around the world for the last, certainly for my lifetime, that significant others have bent the ears of the political will to allow things to happen or laws not to be passed to bring about different agendas. We all know that public opinion, in managing public opinion, people are very conscious that people don't like change. People don't like bearing a cost that they don't think they should bear. And that's been exhibited through the COVID stuff. But certainly for now, I know many people who are saying, well, I like to do something, but I'm not sure what I can. And I think across the world, there's this agenda that says, certainly for the finance markets, if we don't do something, there could be a huge crumbling of some of the finance markets by non-action. So the big players are starting to wake up. Whether in fact they make the big changes, I hope so. I have a daughter that works with a significant engineering consultancy who's working with what's called a circular economy, which is, reuse, recycle, don't waste. But it's also saying, well, everything you build from now on in, you do not build for landfill. You find alternative sources to build with, which is low CO2 emitters. So there is thinking going on now with construction. But of course, it's when we talk about the big changes, it's transport, it's heating, and it's food, which are all so important to individuals' lifestyles that seem to be the driving agendas of personal change.
Well, we may not like change, but we're going to have change. I mean, by the end of this century, people born to the end of the century is the end game date by which everybody is talking about how sea levels will rise and how this, that, and the other will happen by the end of the century. People born today are going to still be alive then, and we're going to have to cope with these things. And I mean, clearly we need food, we need somewhere to live, we need to travel, all those things need to be done. And it doesn't matter very much at all what all the people in Greater Lincolnshire do now. It's requiring international effort, and politicians only do what, politicians only take decisive action if we all tell them to take it and do as they're told. Sorry, there's only 7 of us here tonight. I mean, we're all talking to the converted right now. We need to go out and talk to the unconverted.
Yes, I'll just share with you, Roger, that we've been doing these seminars for 9 months now, and we regard this as being a resource that can be used beyond the event. So it sits on our website, and so the whole behind this is that it is a viewable activity down the line for schools, colleges, other people, community users to look at, and that's the purpose of our agenda. Clifford.
I was just going to say, I would say I'm a little bit more optimistic, Roger, that we used to farm on a very large scale about 20 years ago, and some of our ideas with the use of renewable materials and the like were regarded as utterly cranky then. And we were the largest hemp producers in the UK, and the people that we had to mix with at that time were very strange. And I have realized that just over the last year or two, that that particular crop has got a completely new identity now as being very beneficial to society. So there is a change in mindset going on with people. And that's reflected in the fact that business is actively investing in these things. So certainly from my viewpoint, things are changing. I realise there's going to have to be a massive change over what we're required to meet those objectives, but there is movement in the right direction. And to sort of support Mark in what he's saying, I think that obviously we've lost the sense of community in this country, and very few people know who the neighbours are or who would be able to strike up a conversation. That sense of community hasn't been lost in developing countries. So I think if we can influence developments in developing countries on a community basis, again, that will significantly help. And we've been involved with linking up African universities with British universities and schools, and that seems to be moving. So I'm a little bit more optimistic, but I agree with you that there is an enormous challenge, and there's a lot more shaping up to do in political life and in business life, certainly in the UK.
Yes, I think the rhetoric has changed over the last 30 years, but the action hasn't changed. I mean, only today we were told that the carbon emissions have gone up in the last 10, 20 years, and that doesn't make much sense, does it, in terms of progress? Anyway, I've said my say, so I'll shut up.
I think it's important that these things are raised. It's the real debate that counts. And as Roger says, if people don't buy into this and do something about it, then is it an indictment of them, or is it an indictment of the communication channels that are used by so many others? The documentary drama that I saw recently about the delay in the climate change lobby caused by the questioning of the work of Jones at East Anglia University was a highlighted one. So they've never found the source of the people who influenced the adjustment of the findings there that caused a delay in the settlement. So around the world, whatever local people say, there are also forces at work which will fight the agendas that are against their interests. So it's actually mobilizing the view that says, yes, we can, and we can think about something new and change small and big behaviors. You're quite right about the COP26. It is, and that's why we're here tonight, it is the moment to make the decisions at that national level. And if we were just think about our conversations now, if we were to find 3 things that we want them to do, we need to, perhaps even as a result of this, I'm happy to write as chair and say, I'll send this to anybody that I can to say, these 3 things are the non-negotiables. I mean, one of the things that they talk about is whether we halve the emissions by 2030, half them again by 2040, and half them again by 2050. That's one of the agendas that people keep shouting about. If we don't find ways of doing that, certainly for the greenhouse gases, then we leave our children's children in a position where adaptation and mitigation will be a massive agenda. So I don't know how we take that one forward, but are there other things in terms of lifestyle or agendas we carry as individuals that we can throw out as being ways forward?
Clive, I hear what Roger says, and I do agree. What's happened is happened, and we failed on every count, and that really does apply to big business, who, quite frankly, have pulled the wool over many people's eyes, just to discover later on that what they say they're doing in terms of recycling or whatever just isn't true. What I can say from our project's point of view, and I was at a Humber Net Zero cluster event at Catch 22, a catch, not catch 22, catch building, and never before have I seen so many large companies for the first time ever putting their heads together to look at solutions. And I can tell you that they were more interested in our community-led element. When I walked in that room, I felt out of place, but they welcomed what we were attempting to do at a really, sort of minimal scale. And I was dead pleased, I have got to say, to hear what they were attempting to do, which is significant, and that will make a difference. Perhaps too late, but we can't give up. I think if there's one thing we've got to do is do something. So it's great to see them at least collaborating for the first time ever, instead of seeing each other as enemies. So there's now a Newcastle cluster, there's a Humber cluster, and they're beginning to work together. Now they have got significant funding to develop hydrogen projects, decarbonisation projects that include storing waste under the ground in these huge cabins that are already there apparently. And another thing, while I'm on that fact, is that never before since 2007 have I had any discussions with any local authority about how a community can be part of finding solutions and developing initiatives. That's changed recently again. So we can't go backwards, we must look forward. We have been contacted today by Nottingham Council, who want us to present on their stands at COP. So clearly we're doing something that is having an impact. And I think one of the things that we're doing that's different to others is that we're looking at conservation, renewable energy projects, and sustainable food growing that are all community led. And that's a huge step forward, because beyond the things that we believe we can do on fresh air, remember, we're not funded. What would happen if we were funded? We could triple, quadruple our knowledge sharing capabilities to get other communities involved. So these big companies, I'm hoping I bang the drum loud enough that they can say, we can help you and you can help others, and let's get this knowledge sharing network going, because we're only a bee on its own. And I use this analogy a lot, but when you put a couple of 100,000 together, they do produce something of value, not just to the people, but to the environment. And the local authorities, for the first time ever, are speaking to us, like Nottingham County Council. We're now part of their event on the not on the 4th, it's on the 11th of November. So, it's not all doom and gloom. I agree the damage has been done, but I don't know really what we can do at a very small level to have a major impact on them. But I do see a bigger community movement having more say. You might have even seen the Panorama programme last night about waste plastics, and one of the biggest drinks manufacturers in the world being put under pressure, because now we have got social media. Now we are able to analyse the untruths that they've been saying in terms of their recycling ability of plastic bottles, particularly in third world countries. So, it's going to be community pressure, I think, ultimately, that will drive these others to the table one by one. It may be a longer process. I know we haven't got much time, so we can argue that as well, but somebody's got to grab hold of these guys and point to community-led initiatives that don't cost much, that are scalable, and that we can develop knowledge sharing networks to help other communities, whether it's in this country or international.
Okay, Bert, can you go back to the presentation, please?
Yeah, just bear with me 1 second, Clive. Yeah, where would you like to be?
And the next one down, next one. So what I was really getting behind in our opening discussion was a question about what we really want. So it's about resources for living well, sustainably. And I think what we've heard tonight, again, are some of the barriers, and some of the opportunities. So I was trying to think about what is it that we need to be doing. Roger's raised things around, unless people want to make a change, they won't, and they don't seem to want to do that. So if it's about human behaviors to promote sustainable living, if we think about ourselves as consumers, how we buy things and what we spend our money on and for what purposes, how we are involved in the production activity, making things, selling things, producing things, servicing, working with others, serving others as a producer, and as our citizen role, we think about ourselves as being in a parish, in a district or a council, in a county, or within a nation state, or as part of a broader affiliation of nation states, then what is it that we can be doing as individuals in that? Roger's raised some things there already, and it might be things we want to do around air and land and water. So what I'm really thinking about in the next 5 or 6 minutes is if there are things that you think we could do, or things we can do more of, or what their barriers might be and how we might overcome them. So that was the challenge I'm putting to the group tonight, to come up with, having had a skirt around the issues, what is it that we can be doing? What do we really want?
I think one of the things, Clive, that has already come out tonight, and Roger highlighted that, is these massive countries that are not really listening to other governments to get a consensus of so we have any unilateral sort of working across the globe. But one of the things that interests me, at least this morning, was that there was plenty of discussion on the TV about how consumers are looking at boycotting products that certain countries make. And as we've not been able to provide political solutions to get people round a table, it may well be, and I'm only saying it may well be, that consumers can have an active impact on products that are bought from certain areas to try to get them to come to the table and start talking politically. And you know, it was well documented this morning in the news, and one caller after another were agreeing, because governments won't put sanctions on products coming in because it'll affect our products going to them, and hence the reason why we've not been able to tackle some governments and their behaviours.
So is it about finding ways of documenting the carbon footprint of products? So if I buy something from somewhere, to what extent has that, the process, that the supply chain agenda impacted in greenhouse gases?
I think that,
do we have a label on them saying this is a red, green and amber product?
Well, I
think there's
suppose,
been
I was going to say, Mark, I suppose a sort of example that would interest me is we know around the world that there is plenty of illegal logging going on. And a way to potentially start to influence that as a consumer is, if I buy products with wooden content, is knowing what the origins of that wooden content are, and that it's come from proper sustainable resources and the likes. That's probably at a low level where consumers can start to influence at national and transnational levels.
I think they've had these sort of things going on for a while now, with whether it's organic foods and whether it's the tractor symbols on foods and all this sort of stuff. But what disappoints me, and I don't know personally as an individual whether I can influence them, is when you look at programs, massive global companies like, say, Coca-Cola, who make these millions and millions of plastic bottles every year, and they put on it all the recycling logos and bits and pieces. They've now resorted to put that this product is recyclable, and then it sort of it then has small print if that country has facilities to do so. So in other words, they're pulling the wool over consumers' eyes in a way, because people buying it because they see the recycle signs. But if the country can't recycle it, and we don't as a country, by the way, do very good at all on recycling, because I think 2/3 of our stuff goes out of the country. So we've all got to, help, hopefully, start talking to these companies. And again, it's a bit like, well, I'm not buying a Coca-Cola anymore if you can't actively support those countries where you're making millions by giving them incentives to recycle, or giving them monies to develop community projects and programs. It was really a fascinating program, but they're a massive, massive global company that does print how many bottles it makes and does say things. And one by one, those initiatives that it had promised to do in terms of its recycling and its support for those third world countries was absolutely smashed to smithereens. So we have got an enormous challenge. I mean, if you can't change global companies and you can't change governments, then do we all give up? Well, no. We can't.
Okay, so what I'm raising now is that if it's about the fact that I now know that that's what's happening, I can change my behaviours. If I don't know what's happening, then that. So one of the things is about the audit trail, or the legitimacy of the marketing or the labelling of products which give rise to greenhouse gases. So if there's in the same way they still do health warnings, don't they, on products? Perhaps we could do the same thing with anything we buy as a line that says this is carbon neutral. It's not carbon neutral. It's the extent beyond which it is, greenhouse gas or carbon neutrality. If you are a producer, if you're working anywhere, what can you do as a person that works for a company in terms of its policies and procedures? Everybody that goes to work works in a company that buys things, that trades things, that moves things. To what extent can people in work settings influence their businesses?
Yeah. Difficult one. Okay. Yeah.
Any thoughts? Is that something that trades unions ought to be involved in, or workers' associations? Should it be every teacher, for example, in every school, should be demanding that the school should have a carbon neutral policy in terms of its heating, in terms of its transport to school, or transport agendas for parents? You could only come here if you get your youngster to walk or cycle. Is it as fundamental as that, to say, look, changed behaviours come from those people in those settings where they can make a difference?
Positive behaviour change is critical. We have to educate people about those choices. Whether government policy can then impose it on companies is entirely up to them. I don't think it's a bad start, but we have got to educate. Going back to the community, it's us that drink things, it's us that buy fashion, and within 10 seconds it's ready to throw in the bin. We don't look at recycling all of those things. We pack it in a bag and hope it goes somewhere. We don't quite know where or how or when. So I do think, whether it's foods, whether it's fashion, whether it's travel, they're all areas of concern that we ought to be looking at. And again, to agree with what you're saying, Clive, but again, there has to be a political will to want to do that. But then they need the laws and the enforcement behind it, so that they can get the right information from wherever that product or service comes from. It's a pretty tall order. Okay. But I do think we are sensible. People are sensible, but we've got to get companies to be sensible and not to tell porkies.
So should it be that every bank, for example, that services a company ought to have its green credentials made public? and that any investments that go into products which are not moving towards carbon neutrality are highlighted. Going back to education, should it be that we lobby for every educational establishment and every training program to build in the notion of sustainability within it? Jim Knight, for example, is piloting this or trying to get that through the House of Lords at the moment with a new aspect around sustainability. And of course, in terms of the other parts of the world, Italy and certainly New Zealand are building those things into their curriculum models. Should it be that Russell, who works at Hillside Environmental, is working with Gloucester and Cheltenham College, where they've just recently put in heat pumps and solar panels for a sustainable energy source. But he's also working with their curriculum leaders, looking at the catering department and other departments, the engineering department, on how you build sustainability into all of the education processes at that further and higher education college. So if it's about those in charge of education, those in charge of businesses making the change, is it about how we find ways of celebrating and making those good examples?
Yeah.
Okay. We're nearing the end of our program, and I'm trying to work out if we were to say 3 things. If you go on to the next slide, Bert. How can Greater Lincolnshire contribute to our desired outcomes? I was at the Climate Commission held at the Showground recently, where something like 400 people were in attendance, looking at how Greater Lincolnshire can make a difference to the climate lobby, organised by Lincolnshire County Council and a man there called Dan Clayton, who was the chief person in charge of the programme. And talking with him, he says, how do we get this agenda spread across businesses, education and communities in Greater Lincolnshire? We've attempted to do something tonight. Is there any more I or we can do?
Clive, group, just something which is a very practical thing is living in a house which is 118 years old. And there's lots of properties around the country which are old, perhaps not as old as this. But it's how do we go to the future in terms of heating? And when the information you get is so mixed, you know, try this, do that. And there needs to be some sort of honesty or some sort of reliable source of information where you could get really good advice to say, this is what you should do. What is the best plan forward for you? Or pick up on other people's knowledge. It's very difficult to know, because we'll have to spend money on that, or the government will, or people those things will have to be subsidized. But where do you get the best advice? Otherwise, people are going to be spending money and find out, hang on, that was a scam. That was not effective. I should have done this. And we've got one opportunity, perhaps in the next 20 years, in many properties. And I'm just talking about heating, but there are other things reliant on that where we need reliable information which we can trust.
Okay.
Well, everybody can obtain an energy performance certificate for their property. And you're required to do that if you're going to sell the property or rent it.
Yeah.
If everybody had a energy performance certificate, they're going to cost about £50 or £70, and either they could buy them or the government could enforce them, and then follow the advice in that and improve the performance of the house.
Yeah, I know that, but it's actually very basic, and what you need is something much more. Which product should you buy when it comes to new heat pumps or to other?
I think you need what might be helpful is that there is independent, not-for-profit organisations now. Yeah. We happen to be partners with Community Energy England, for instance, who are linked with Octopus Energy, the Co-op Energy, Co-op Power, Power to Change. So there are a number of cooperatives, as I would call them, that are not for profit and independent. So they're not out there to, oh, you need an air source pump, a heat source pump, or this or that. They're there to give you good, impartial advice and guidance, and they may be worth a conversation. And again, I keep going back to the community and that empowerment to educate people just like yourselves. And don't forget, there are people in this region, particularly given the employment status in what you would term fuel poverty, who really need significant support and help. And again, it's about going to the right areas, not just Googling, please help me with a particular thing, or else you're liable to get the salesman knocking on your door in 10 minutes. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but Community Energy England, anybody can be a member. We are.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark. Just to say, next slide, Bert. Again, I started with this, and it's again, we sit around here and do these conversations, and it throws up on reflection lots of small pointers. We've talked about information. We've talked about validity of information. We talked about our role as consumers, as producers, as citizens, to asking the questions about our nature of our living around air and land and water, and how whether in fact we as individuals can do things, or whether it requires others to do things with us, or whether it requires legislation at a higher level to make the differences. I hope that COP26 will provide us with some information around those agendas, and I look forward to hearing certainly from Mark and certainly from Clifford on their return from COP26 about how things can work. I'm mindful of our time, and I'm going to say to everybody that thank you for tonight, and thank you for the dialogue and discussion. It will be useful to keep that recorded. Our next session in November is actually on migration, and I'm indebted to David Whittaker, not as it shows on the screen there, who is leading that one. But I believe we have also some support from United Nations staff from both either UK or other parts of the world that might be helpful in our discussions on migration, such an important topic going forward. So thank you once again to everybody, and I call it to an end with a thank you to everybody. Thank you very much.